Hello and welcome to the Burrow. This is the fourth video in our series on the Burrows Badgers skirmish game. In this video we're going to be taking a look at some of the actions your Warband's characters can perform. We'll also be looking at how your characters suffer damage and the effects wounds will have on them. The actions we're going to be having a look at are the sprint action, the attack action, the shoot action and the cast spell action. Alright, so we'll start with the sprint action. It is the most straightforward and simple one after all. A sprint action lets you make two moves. That's all there is to it. Your character making a sprint action can carry out two moves consecutively. That's all they can do that turn, but it does get you around the board very quickly. Alright, the attack action. A character making an attack action can make one move, and that move must end with the model in base contact with the enemy model you're attacking. If you cannot reach base contact for any reason, for instance such as moving through difficult terrain, then the attack action would fail and your model would simply stop at the end of its move and do nothing else that turn. If you move more than 2 inches getting into base contact, then you'll gain a +2 bonus to your roll. Basically, you've charged in, you've moved over 2 inches to get into base contact, you get a +2 bonus to your attack action's roll. However, to gain that bonus, at no point can your move have taken you further away from the enemy than you were when you started. So basically no running backwards a couple of inches first just to try and charge in a bit further and get the bonus. Once in base contact, the acting model makes a roll off using their strike stat against the opposing model's block stat. Apply any modifiers as appropriate, such as the +2 bonus you might have got for charging in. If the attack succeeds, if the acting player's strike roll plus or minus any modifiers beats the opposing player's block roll, then the defending model's been wounded and will have to mark off a number of wound boxes on his warband roster equal to the result. Here's an example. Fleabite Hardpad the Rat attacks Garrick Longear the Hare. He moves 5 inches into base contact, so he gains the +2 modifier to his roll for charging. His strike statistic is a D8, so he rolls that D8 and he scores a 6. He adds the +2 for charging for a total roll of 8. Garrick Longear the Hare has a block statistic of D6, so he rolls a D6, scoring a 3. He's got no modifiers, so his roll is 3. Fleabite's roll was 8, which is higher than Garrick's roll of 3, so the attack has succeeded. To see how well it succeeded, we subtract that 3 from the 8, giving us a result for the roll-off of 5. So Garrick suffers 5 wounds, and he'd mark those off on his warband roster. Okay. Outnumbering. If a model that's being attacked has more than one enemy model in base contact with it, then it's considered to be outnumbered. And an outnumbered model suffers a -1 penalty to block roll-offs for every enemy model in base contact with it. Now it seems outnumbering is a thing a lot of people get confused by, but really it's very simple. You ignore outnumbering altogether until it becomes relevant, and the only time it's relevant is when someone makes an attack action. That's when the model that's being attacked needs to see how many enemies are in base contact with it. Does the model that's being attacked have more than one enemy in base contact at that point? If the answer is yes, then they are outnumbered and they suffer a penalty equal to the total number of enemy models in base contact. Here's an example. There's a big, complicated fight going on between the blue warband and the red warband. Now this model makes an attack action against this model. And this model has a total of 3 enemy models in base contact with it. So the model is outnumbered and suffers a -1 penalty to their block roll for each enemy in base contact. So 3 enemies in base contact, a total of -3 to the block roll for outnumbering. Moving out of combat. If you're in base contact with an enemy model that moves, you can do nothing provided the enemy model does not move more than 2 inches. But if that enemy model does move more than 2 inches during that move, then any of your models that were in base contact with it at the start may make an immediate free attack action. Doesn't cost you any actions and you can do it even if you've already taken an action that turn. It's slightly different to a normal attack action. You make your strike roll off as normal, but it's taken against your opponent's nimbleness rather than their block, as they're trying to leg it away. Shoot actions. A model making a shoot action may first make one move. The move has to end with the model able to draw at least partial line of sight to the target model, and that target model must be within range of the weapon being used. If the shooter decides not to move, then instead they gain a +2 bonus to the ranged roll-off for aiming. Now the shooting model takes a roll-off using their ranged statistic against the target model's nimbleness statistic. Apply any modifiers as appropriate. Now if the roll-off is a success, if the shooting model's ranged roll beats the defending model's nimbleness roll, then the missile has hit and the target is wounded and will suffer a number of wounds equal to the result. Now it's worth noting that you cannot roll off for shooting while you're in base contact with an enemy or within 2 inches of an enemy, but you could first move away. Obviously you'd risk taking the free hit then. Now, if the model that's making the shoot action only has partial line of sight to its target, then there's a -1 penalty to their roll. In addition, if the target model is in base contact with a terrain piece, they can claim some benefit from the cover from that, so there's also a -1 penalty to the shooter's roll for that as well. And they're cumulative, so if you've only got partial line of sight to someone who's in base contact with terrain, that would be a total -2 penalty. Shooting into combat. Well, what happens if one of your friendly models is in combat with an enemy model and you decide to try and take a pot shot at them? Well, you can do that, but first you have to roll a d6. On a roll of 3 to 6, that's fine, you shoot as normal. Treat it just like any other shoot action, you can target that enemy. If you roll a 1 or a 2, however, you've hit your friendly model. Now, if there's more than one friendly model in base contact at the time, your opponent gets to choose which one's been hit. And you just carry out the shoot action normally, rolling your ranged dice against your own character's nimbleness and apply any damage that gets caused to your own character. So it's a bit risky. The cast spell action. A model making a cast spell action may make one move before casting, but if they choose not to make that move, then they gain a +2 bonus to the casting roll-off. To cast a spell, the player makes a Fortitude or Presence roll-off against the target number of the spell. Whether it's Fortitude or Presence depends on the type of magic you're casting. It will tell you at the top of your list whether it's Fortitude-based or Presence-based. So you make your roll-off, and if your roll is equal to or lower than the spell's target number, then the spell fails to cast. But if you roll over that target number, then the spell is successfully cast. Apply its effects as it says in the spell descriptions. Now, some spells don't have a target number. Instead, they require you to roll off against one of your opponent's statistics. In those cases, if the roll you make is higher than your opponent's roll, the spell is successfully cast, so apply its effects immediately. If you roll lower, the spell will fail. Now, a lot of spells will require line of sight and have a maximum range. Again, it'll tell you that in the spell's description. The target you're trying to affect with the spell has to be in range to be affected by it. Again, like shooting, if you've only got partial line of sight, then there's a -1 to your roll. Now, spells that have a range listed cannot be cast if you're in base contact with an enemy model. Spells which don't have a range listed can be cast at any time, whether you're in base contact with enemies, wherever you are. But if the spell has a range listed, you can't cast it if you're in base contact with an enemy. You could move back slightly first, and then cast it, of course. Now, if you want to, a spell can always be cast onto the caster themselves, or onto another model in your warband, even if that model was hidden. Provided it's one of your friendly models, you can always cast the spell onto it. So generally that would only apply to positive spells, healing, things like that, rather than spells that cause damage. It's important to note though that if a magic user is ever taken out of action, any long-term spells that they had cast would immediately end. Spells will often list an ingredient or two in the spell's description. Those ingredients can be used to improve the power of the spell, make it easier to cast, or change its effects in some way. You can get those ingredients either through purchase on the open trading list when you're buying equipment for your characters, or some of the den upgrades allow you to grow your own ingredients. Now, if your character has ingredients in their equipment and decides to use them to give a boost to their spell, you have to declare that before you cast the spell. They can only be used once, so you have to cross them off your warband roster once they've been used. If you are going to use them, you've got to tell your opponent before you make any rolls, and if the spell fails, then the ingredient is unfortunately wasted, but if it succeeds, you gain the extra benefit from that. Casting spells into combat. Supposing you've got an enemy model that you want to cast a spell at, and a friendly model is in base contact with them. Can you still cast a spell at them? Well, generally speaking, yes, any spell can be cast in that way. The exception are spells that cause direct damage, spells such as the lightning spell or Morglum's fiery blast. Anything that causes direct damage to your opponent can be a bit risky to cast into combat. So if you want to cast a wounding spell at a target model which is in base contact with your friendly models, then just like if you were shooting at them with a bow, you have to roll a d6 first, and on a 3 to 6 you can cast the spell as normal. You can target the enemy with that spell, just do it as a normal cast spell roll off. If you roll a 1 or a 2, unfortunately though, then your spell has hit your friendly model. If there's more than one friendly model in the base contact there, then your opponent gets to choose which ones hit. And again, just like shooting, when you've accidentally shot a friendly model, you just carry out your cast spell roll off normally and apply any damage effects to that friendly model. Wounds. Now, in a lot of cases during the game, a character will take wounds. They'll take damage, whether it's from combat actions, shooting, magic, or falling off a wall. There's a lot of ways you can take damage. And when that happens, what you do is you cross off a number of wound boxes on your warband roster equal to the number of wounds suffered. You cross them off from left to right. Now as you do so, you're going to notice that some of those wound boxes are shaded in a darker colour. For each one of those you've crossed off, that character will suffer a -1 penalty to every roll off they have to take. So as you can see, the more shaded boxes you've crossed off, the less effective your character is. If a character suffers more wounds than the 16 wound boxes they have on their warband roster, however, they'd be considered out of action. Note though that there has to be more than the 16. If they'd crossed off all 16 but hadn't suffered any more wounds, they'd still be up and fighting. But as soon as they go off the end of that wound track, then they'd be considered out of action. They'll play no further part in the game and remove the model from the table. After the game, you'll have to check to see if that character has suffered permanent injury. Modifier skills and their effect on wounds. Many characters have special skills listed on their profile, whether they've got these skills through experience or whether they're naturally part of their racial bonuses. 4 of these skills, the strong, tough, weak and delicate skills, are known as modifier skills. When you see those skills, they'll have a set of brackets after them and with a number in the brackets, and that number in the brackets indicates the skills level. For instance, if you had strong and then after that strong in brackets there was a 3, that would be strong level 3. Now the way modifier skills work is they provide either positive or negative modifiers to the wounds that you take and the wounds that you cause. The number in the brackets after the name of the skill is the value, the amount that those things change by. The 4 skills work like this, starting with strong. The strong skill adds its value to any wounds the character causes using attack or shoot actions. So if you're a character with strong 3 and you make a successful attack action with, say, a result of 4, normally that would cause 4 wounds. But because you're strong 3, you'd add that on and actually cause 7 wounds. The tough skill is pretty much the reverse of the strong skill. It lets you absorb more damage. So anytime a character with the tough skill takes wounds, they reduce that total by the level of the skill. So for example, if you've got tough 3 and you get attacked and you take 8 wounds, then you reduce that by your tough level. So tough 3 would reduce it by 3 and take those 8 wounds down to 5 wounds. So you suffer a lot less damage if you've got the tough skill. Now, weak and delicate are basically the reverse versions of strong and tough. So weak, if your character is weak, then you'd subtract that skills level from the amount of damage it causes. And delicate would mean your character would suffer more damage when they take wounds. So for example, a character who's got weak 2, when they make an attack action, if they're successful with their attack action and it would have caused 4 wounds, then because they're weak 2, they subtract that 2 from the damage caused and they'd only cause 2 wounds. Equally, if a character has delicate 4 and then they get attacked and the attack would cause 8 wounds, they have to add their delicate 4 to that, so they actually suffer 12 wounds. So characters who are weak and delicate are really bad in close combat. Try and keep them safe if you can. Generally, that's magic users who've suffered penalties for learning spells. Finally, it's worth noting that these skills, strong and weak and tough and delicate, cancel each other out. For example, if you have a character who is weak 1 and then they gain the strong 1 skill, those two things cancel each other out, so you basically lose the weak skill, wouldn't gain the strong skill, you just stay at 0. Well, that about covers the rules for sprinting, attacking, shooting and casting spells. In the next video, we'll finish looking at the actions that you can carry out, going on to some of the more advanced stuff like hiding, ambushing and searching. Thank you for watching.